This is allowing for more government control, which allows them more sophisticated ways to extort from the people and to violate their rights. Because you said the money's going into the pension hole. So this is the government, the state government holding money over the local government, saying you need to do what we want or you're not going to get your money. But those local officials are getting paid. When that money funnels through, right, into the pensions, you want to explain a little bit how that works? Because this is the root of government corruption, not only at the state level and federal level, because it's coming from the top down, but at the local level. And we can also talk about how the local government officials, their role in protecting the local community from government overreach, tyranny, violation, unlawful government tyrannical abuse, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So I think there's two parts to that question. The first part of the question is the issue of the pensions. Let's deal with that,
okay.
And then we'll come back to the part about the proper role of state and local officials, in particular municipal officials. Let's deal with the pension issue. So I ran for Berkeley City Auditor. I spent the last 10 years of my life living in Berkeley before COVID hit, and I ran for City Auditor in 2018. It was a test, and the reason I ran for City Auditor is I've been paying attention to city finances for a long time. And Berkeley's finances are copy-paste across the entire state. The same problem that happened in Berkeley exists here in Shasta County. The numbers are slightly different. The reality is still the same, which is that you have decades of public officials making promises to their public employees that they simply could not afford to keep. There was a whole bunch of reasons why they made those promises, inclusive of the fact that the union contracts are negotiated by city managers, right? And the city manager also is an employee who gets pension benefits from the same CalPERS that they're negotiating benefits with for all their employees. So the way that it basically works, and I'm oversimplifying, is that when the city manager negotiates a benefits for all the employees, they have a personal stake to get the same benefits for themselves, essentially. That's the shortcut version. There's a little bit more complex, but that's the shortcut version of the way I can explain this. So you have a city manager who has an inherent conflict of interest in negotiating a union contract for their employees because they know they're going to get a piece of the pie, essentially. So then the contract gets negotiated, and the contract then gets voted on by the city council or the county board, as in the case in Shasta County. And the issue there is that so you have the public employees, including the city manager, and then you have the elected officials. Well, the elected officials are also, the Shasta County Board of Supervisors gets public benefits. If they serve for 2 terms on the board, they get the same CalPERS benefits as some of the employees. So there's that inherent bias that propagates the system. And what you have is years and years and years of decades at this point of promises being made to public employees that the cities and the counties simply could not afford to pay. And so as time goes on, there's all of these other variables happen in the market. Market falls and crashes. You get returns from the market that just aren't as rosy as they had said they would. And you end up with these giant pension holes where the cities and counties around California owe billions of dollars to CalPERS that they have no plan of how to fill the hole absent a magic money printer from the federal government, because the federal government can just print money. The states cannot do that. And so in Berkeley, it was $500 million. I believe the figures were somewhere around $500 million in unfunded pension liabilities that they owed to CalPERS. $500 million. And then Berkeley also had another problem, which is they had another $500 million roughly in deferred maintenance, where they just said, "Oh, we're not going to pave the roads this year. Oh, we're not going to rebuild the pools." So all of a sudden, you have pools being filled in with sand, You have a pier that's crumbling into the ocean, and you have no money to maintain it. So on one side you have all this deferred maintenance, on the other side you have all these pension holes. And so there's this giant liability, and the giant liability basically crisis that's been brewing for years and years and years before COVID comes along. COVID comes along, and all of a sudden it's gee whiz, we have this crazy event that's going to obviously justify massive spending by the government. And gee, we have a hole that needs to be filled. And so all of a sudden you have the federal government bailout, the CARES Act, the second CARES Act, now the American Recovery Act, and you have this magic money printer where the federal government is basically flooding the market with money. And the issue is that what ended up happening in Shasta County in particular, but it's also copy-paste across the entire state, is that the local officials on the county level basically did this calculus, and they said, well, gee whiz, people's civil liberties, not so important. Church, not so important. Businesses going bankrupt, not so important. We're going to get this money from the state. And Mary Rickard in a public flat out said, at one point, Mary, who's a supervisor here, said, oh, gee, and I'm paraphrasing, she said something like, Shasta County is a very poor county. We need the state money. Well, gee, there's other ways to fix the problem. Mm-hmm. You don't need the magic money printer. You don't need to sell out people's civil liberties. You don't need to be shutting down churches. You don't need to be destroying businesses. You simply need to put on your adult pants and start doing hardball negotiation with the unions and saying, no, gee whiz, we're going to renegotiate these contracts. We're going to start looking at, the left likes to talk about inequality a lot. And there is no grosser inequality than what I've seen in the pension funds, where you have these city managers and CEO, and here the CEO of the county, who they go and they do X number of years with one city, get their pension there, then they do years at another city, get it, and they start double dipping. And so what you end up with is these pensions of $2, $4, $500,000 a year in some cases, that we're owing a dozen different people for every city in America, and you got all these employees at different levels who are collecting this. So the inequality there is that we're not talking about the teacher who has a $50,000 pension. We're not talking about the janitor who has a $75,000 pension. We're talking about the administrative staff, which have they're basically been double dipping, triple dipping in some cases, and collecting multiple pensions from multiple different agencies in huge amounts, and just staying long enough to collect those multiple pensions. So you have this pension hole, you have the money printer coming out, and you have a fundamental abdication of responsibility, which really brings me to your second question that you asked, which is there's a question about what is the proper role of municipal and state officials, and particularly municipal officials on the county and city level. And, at every level of our government, we have a representative democracy, essentially, a representative government, a Republican government. And the role of the public officials is to represent. They're not leaders. Mm-hmm. They're representative. They're there to represent the will of the public. And so the role of the officials at every level of government is to represent the will of the constituents. And the role of the representatives on the local government is to represent the will of the local constituents. And when you have such a vast divide in opinion between Governor Newsom and Shasta County citizens, where Shasta County citizens by a 78% margin, I've done the polling, I know the numbers, 78% margin oppose the lockdowns. And you have our officials who are saying, well, we're going to side with Governor Newsom. They fundamentally fail to do their job, which is to represent the will of the people and to serve as a buffer between the tyrannical government, because when you have a government that doesn't represent the people, it becomes a tyrannical government, which is what our state government has become at this point. They were supposed to be a buffer. Mm-hmm. They were supposed to be the good guys who came in and said, no. We're going to ask, at the very minimum, we're going to put forward a declaration saying, we're gonna be a business sanctuary. We're gonna be open for business. We're gonna open up our church. We're not gonna follow all these things because the public wants us to do this. And they could have at the very least said, tell OSHA, please stay out. ABC, alcohol, whatever, in beverage control, stay out. They could have done that. They could have said, Shasta County is open for business because the people here want us to be open for business. Mary Rickard, Leonard Modi, and Joe Clementi did not do that. Instead, they said, we need the state cash. So they basically sold out our churches, they sold out our businesses, they sold out our basic civil liberties for the state cash. Because at the end of the day, they understand something else, which is they understand that the public employees are one of the most reliable voting blocks out there. So what they know is that if they keep the public employees happy and keep the gravy train going for public employees, more than likely they're going to get reelected. And this web becomes really complex. And I know I just covered a whole bunch of stuff. There was a whole lot of ground I covered. But there is a reality. This is basic corruption at a certain point. Mm-hmm. But it's also legalized corruption. Mm-hmm. Because why would you steal from the taxpayer when you could just simply make a law that makes that legal? Which is what fundamentally where we are right now.
So not only do the county supervisors have a role in representative government and being a buffer to government overreach, but also the sheriff has a unique role to represent the local constituents. Can you?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question to ask, because so in America we have the police departments and we have the sheriffs. The sheriffs are constitutional officers who are elected at a local level, but they're a constitutional officer whose job is to enforce the Constitution, and they only answer to the people, the voters. Now, the county boards set their budgets, and so there is a check and balance on the budget issue. And so what we ended up with is this really interesting reality where a lot of the sheriffs around California very early on looked at this and said, no, this is a violation of people's constitutional rights. We're not going to be enforcing this. And so that's a lot of what happened here in Shasta County. Is very early on, our sheriff here said, we're not going to be putting business owners in jail.
So you mentioned something very interesting. You said the word legalized corruption, and you've been going to the Board of Supervisors meetings pretty regularly, and so you've uncovered a lot of the ins and outs of the flow of money and the corruption, that legalized corruption that you're talking about. Can you go a little deeper into that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that happens when people talk about government is that there's a pretty widespread assumption that our government is fundamentally corrupt. Mm-hmm. The problem is that most people don't realize what that actually looks like, because the sort of corruption we see in America is very uniquely American. It's not like the sort of corruption you see in Africa or other places, or Russia for that matter, where a police officer pulls you over and you have to give him 50 rubles in order to keep going down the road. Like, that's not the kind of, we don't see that kind of corruption in America for the most part. I'm sure there are some places where that happens, but it's not the issue here. What we see in America is a lot of what I consider to be legalized corruption, where because people are not paying attention, instead of breaking the law, they simply change the law. And they make these sort of things that should be illegal, legal. So to give you an example of what happened here in Shasta County is that we got $21.9 million coming in from the CARES Act, that magic money printer that I keep talking about from the federal government. And so the money came into the Shasta County coffers, and Shasta County held multiple meetings during the board meetings. They were trying to decide what to do with the money. So initially they were going to spend $300,000. They were going to give $300,000 to local businesses and everything else to the public servants. So $21.9 million comes in. They've destroyed, decimated, harmed local business for months and months and months, and they say, oh, here's $300,000. I mean, that alone says volumes. $300,000 and $21.6 million to public servants who never lost a penny. We're all in this together, right? We're all in this together, right? Sure we are. However, so here we are, $300,000 comes in. Apparently a vote was taken. I wasn't there for the vote to give $300,000 to local businesses. A contract was signed between Shasta County and something called the Forward Reading Foundation. Forward Reading Foundation, for all intents and purposes, is the Chamber of Commerce. It's the Jake Mangus, who is the CEO of the Chamber of Commerce, is the CEO, as far as I'm aware, of the Forward Reading Foundation. The Forward Reading Foundation has been a container through which federal and state monies are dispersed to the community. Committee for many years. It's been around since the 80s, if I remember correctly. I pulled all the Public Record Act requests, so I've read the actual contract between Shasta County and the Forward Reading Foundation, which that was signed by Jake Mangus and the Shasta County Board of Supervisors. So what's interesting about that contract is that it was completely reasonable at that point, which was that $300,000 was going to be given to Forward Reading Foundation to give out $5,000 grants to local businesses. In exchange for doing that, Forward Reading Foundation would take 5% of the proceeds. So 5% of $300,000 is $15,000. Which is a perfectly reasonable amount for all intents and purposes. Like, it makes sense that we cost about that much to administer the program, right? Like, that makes perfect sense. $300,000 going into local businesses, 5% going to Forward Reading for cutting the checks, doing all the administration, all the oversight. That makes perfect sense. What doesn't make sense is what happened next. So we went from, I was in the board chambers when this happened, where it came up for a vote. All these amounts came up for a vote. And Joe Clemente spoke up saying, no, we need to give more money to our local businesses. Leonard Money, the other supervisor, steps in and says, okay, I'll give you $1 million to stolen video. Joe Clemente says, no, I don't know about that. Some mumble something, no. $2 million. $3 million. Sold, basically. So for $3 million, Joe Clemente, he basically got Joe Clemente to go on board, because now Joe can say, oh gee, I stood up for the business. Now let's put this in context, Joe, and for all of our supervisors. $21.9 million comes in, $3 million goes to local businesses they've destroyed for months and months and months. So let's up with $19 million, somewhere around there, $19 million going to public servants who never lost a paycheck. Mm-hmm. It's going right basically into that pension fund. I mean, we're all in this together. We're all in this together. $19 million going to our public servants who never lost a check, and then only $3 million going to local businesses. That whole $22 million should have been going to local businesses who have lost millions of dollars in profit. Anyway, so that aside. So now we have a vote that comes down, and we went from $300,000 to $3 million going to local businesses through the Forward Reading Foundation. What did not change, and I read the amended contract, was the 5% figure. So we went from $15,000 to $150,000 going to the Forward Reading Foundation for doing the same exact task. Exact same task. Like, nothing changed. The only thing that changed is the total amount. I mean, they certainly didn't end up with 10 times more work. So the chamber got $150,000. So all of that aside, so where is the legalized corruption happening? Well, this is where things get interesting. So about a year prior, back in March or so, I believe of last year, 2020, the Greater Reading Chamber of Commerce PAC, the Public Action Committee, gave $2,500 to Steve Morgan. Steve Morgan was one of the 4 votes who made. So they gave $2,500 to this gentleman to run for re-election, and he then turned around and approved these contracts that gave him $150,000 back. $2,500 in, $150,000 back out in return on investment. That's a phenomenal return on investment right there. Now, I started going back and saying, oh my goodness, this can't possibly be legal. Oh, it is legal. It is absolutely legal for someone to take money for their campaign and then to turn around and give our money to that entity or person. And so there is that level of issue going on. The other level of the corruption that's going on here is a very basic question of, wait a second, the Shasta County has its own finance department. Why is Shasta County not able to cut the checks themselves? Well, the only reason you would funnel this through an entity like the Forward Reading Foundation is to create this system of benefit, perks, kickbacks back to their campaigns. That's how this is all legalized. And so you end up with this basically essentially legalized corruption. So that's just one example. But another example is just how everything functions with the pensions, where you have the county employees basically signing their own paychecks. The county manager, who gets the CalPERS benefits, who gets the pensions, who gets all the pays, is the one who's negotiating these contracts. And then he brings to the Shasta County Board of Supervisors, who then rubber stamps the thing. So you have all of these layers and layers and layers. You have a system that is fundamentally designed not to benefit the citizens, the taxpayers, but rather the county employees. Now, that's not because they're evil. That's not because they're bad. It's just human nature. when the public is not paying attention to what their representatives are doing, their representatives are going to optimize for their own good. And for their own good means taking money out of your pocket, out of my pocket, and putting it in theirs. Completely legally, completely lawfully, because the legal structure gets changed, not because there's corruption of normal kind, but just because they're taking care of themselves, because we're not paying attention. Does that make sense?
Yes.